Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. It has been a hot minute since I've posted. I blame mostly moving, stress, moving, but we're coming back hot with another Baedel video. In this case, I am giving a audio version of one of my friend's Medium articles that's actually talking about Baedels. So I am not going to be having any commentary with this one. I will have that in a future video, but I thought this would be a fun start before I go disappear again, this time going to Disney with my friend and spouse. So, without further ado, let's get started. The article is titled, Let's Talk About Baedels, a Comprehensive Retrospective, starting with a disclaimer. This post is not claiming that trans women do not suffer or do not suffer as much as other groups of trans people. It is not claiming that all trans women are baeddels or adjacent, nor is it claiming that all trans women oppress anyone else. Trans misogyny is real and requires much more acknowledgement than it currently receives. The trans community is very much capable of trans misogyny and often does enact or enable it. Likewise, trans people also often enact and enable transphobia against other parts of the trans community. If you take only one thing from the following, take this. We all need to work on being better allies to each other. None of us can gain anything without the rest of us. Setting the stage for baedelism. We can't talk about baedelism without talking about Tumblr user at Monetize Your Cat, or Cat, and the ideology she popularized on the website in the early 2010s. Cat was a loud voice with a huge blog in the early days of Tumblr. Most of her popular content was humor-based, but she also championed an ideology that synthesized certain aspects of feminism, transfeminism, and communist ideals. Cat's ideology is better explained here and can be further explored here, but this is the foundation. Manhood is inherently oppressive and cannot exist outside the context of oppression. Gender can be, to some extent, a choice. Because of the above, one's gender is an ethical choice with ethical consequences. Being a man is, therefore, ethically harmful and wrong, particularly if you are giving up womanhood in order to be a man. Being a woman is, therefore, ethically correct, particularly if you are giving up manhood in order to be a woman. You may recognize some of the ideas here as a version of radical feminism, namely, the idea that manhood/men are inherently oppressive and that womanhood/women are inherently victims. All Cat had to do was map radical feminism onto the trans community. If manhood is bad and men are bad, then trans men who reject womanhood in favor of becoming men are bad. If womanhood is good and women are good, then trans women who reject manhood in favor of womanhood are the best. Which of course would also explain why society hates them more than any other trans person, something taken for granted by Cat and many others at the time. This foundation was built upwards into a more complicated system of beliefs. Cis men were viewed as potential trans women. People who did not yet know whether they were trans, had not made that choice, and could conceivably still choose to be women. As such, cis men were often seen as better than trans men. Trans men were encouraged to detransition. Men in general were encouraged to reject their manhood in favor of womanhood, and sissification became a hallmark joke that the community forming around Cat latched onto. The gender is a choice part of this ideology is a bit hard for most people to swallow, and Cat herself did not entirely ascribe to the idea that gender was always a choice. Still, even if men were intrinsically and inherently men, and even if they couldn't simply choose not to be men the way she had, the idea remained that the so-called ethical consequences of being a man and the harm this did to the collective vastly outweighed the personal harm suffered by remaining or becoming a woman. It was, in short, more ethical to suffer dysphoria in pursuit of womanhood than it was to accept one's manhood. It's unclear whether Cat ever identified as a baedel, and she certainly didn't begin the movement herself. She was definitely close to it, though, and many attest that her ideology constituted the building blocks of the Baeddelism movement. Establishing an ideology. Tumblr post by Black Metal Baedel. Don't call yourself a misandrist if you are not opposed to trans men as much as cis men. Under patriarchy, all men are the enemy. The first post on Baeddelism was by Tumblr user at Unobject on October 2nd, 2013. Bad, origin, Old English, Baedel, hermaphrodite, womanist man, to bad, Middle English, an object. Just saying. This post was liked by @LeslieHarpy, also one of the original Baedels. This post first provided the name and defining ideology of the Baedel movement. The conclusion drawn from the post was, essentially, that because The root word bad was baedel, and because baedel referred to intersex people and womanish men, this Old English slur was proof that transmisogyny was the worst form of bigotry, and even, perhaps, the root of all bigotry. It's worth noting this etymology is likely inaccurate and ahistorical, along with problematic in several other ways. While Unobject was the first person to make this connection, Autogynephil, or Eve, eventually became, in essence, the figurehead of the movement. Of the other baeddels, some of them were explicitly aware and supportive of the ideology behind baedelism. Some of them were young or newly out trans women seduced by the personalities involved, and some of them were tangential enough to the movement that they didn't really even know what it was. Baedelism was sort of a trend for a time, and many participants wore the name without entirely knowing what it meant. It is important to acknowledge that as much as there were dedicated members of baedelism, and as much as there was a unified ideology behind it, there were also individual baeddels who did not understand, let alone support, the ideology. That said, the belief system. Baeddels essentially built upon the foundation of Monetize Your Cat's ideology that had been gaining traction on Tumblr in the years prior, with some additions that ultimately defined their movement. Transmisogyny is the form of oppression from which all, or most, other forms of oppression stem. Privilege is granted on the basis of assigned sex, AFAB or assigned female at birth versus AMAB or assigned male at birth. These fundamentals of baedelism were essentially a rebranded form of radical feminism, much like Cat's ideology. In particular, they drew from radical feminist ideas that misogyny was the primary form of oppression, that which all other oppression stemmed from. Baeddels only tweaked this idea to replace misogyny with transmisogyny, which led to the rest of the conclusions Baeddels drew. Men are inherently oppressors, and women are inherently oppressed. Trans women are inherently victims. Because only AMAB people can experience transmisogyny, they are inherently more oppressed than AFAB people. AFAB privilege. The idea that within the queer and or trans community, AFAB people receive unique privilege and positions of power that AMAB people do not. There is no transphobia separate from transmisogyny. All transphobia stems from transmisogyny first, and transphobia as it impacts non-trans feminine trans people is incidental at most. It's important to note that these ideas were not all as universal as the first two, and different individual baeddels held them to different extents. Trans-lesbian separatism was what the movement was ultimately defined by, as the logical conclusion of their other beliefs, much like lesbian separatism was a logical conclusion of radical feminist beliefs. Baeddels believe that only trans women can understand, or be truly safe for, other trans women. Therefore, contact with anyone who was not a trans woman was deemed dangerous and highly discouraged. Trans men also played an important role in Baeddel ideology, and the resulting treatment of trans men is what is often remembered today. Baeddels generally believe the following, either explicitly or implicitly. Trans men are not oppressed, nor marginalized at all. Trans men do not experience transmisogyny. Trans men do not experience misogyny, even prior to transition. Trans men have access to male privilege. Trans men have an easier time passing and frequently go stealth, thus benefiting from male privilege as well as cis privilege. Trans men are often, or always, misogynistic and transmisogynistic, and are not held accountable for this. Trans men actively choose manhood even when presented with the option of womanhood. Trans men oppress cis women. Trans women enacting violence on trans men is punching up at oppressors, and therefore not only permitted but encouraged. Trans men become aggressive and violent when they go on testosterone HRT. Non-binary people are often overlooked when summarizing baedelism, but baeddels did have plenty to say about them. Baeddel ideology relied on the idea that privilege was granted on the basis of assigned sex. Non-binary people's genders were thus treated as irrelevant. They essentially did not believe non-binary people truly existed. See, AFAB non-binary people are either trans men attempting to invade women's spaces, or cis women pretending to be trans. See, AMAB non-binary people are actually just trans women who haven't accepted it yet. They must transition or they are transmisogynistic. Another screenshot of a post from Wait Then Wife Bunny. Can we just ban CAFABs from claiming to be trans, please? Hashtag men can't be trans, they can only be men. Autogynephil. Cosigned. Beta layer. Cosigned. Pinned to the top of my blog, etc. Intersex people. Intersex experiences and intersex history were often co-opted and erased by baedelism. This was often more a byproduct of their beliefs than an overtly stated idea, but most notably the term baedel itself is likely more applicable, if not exclusively applicable, to intersex people rather than trans women, making their reclamation of it as a transmisogynistic slur or their claim that the word's existence means that transmisogyny is the root of all oppression incredibly ignorant, if not actively harmful misinformation. Trans women did not receive universally positive treatment either. Baedelism was very much a cult-like group built around the firmly held conviction that they were absolutely correct and that anyone who disagreed with them was the enemy. Trans women who disagreed with them were generally seen as brainwashed and self-hating, and trans women who did agree with them were expected to subjugate themselves to the ringleaders of the movement. Within baedel circles, trans women were most frequently victimized by the abusers allowed to run rampant because trans women do not and cannot harm anyone else, including, apparently, each other. They were also bad, shitty, abusive people in general. A bunch of them passed around a pile of smear campaigns and false rumors about virtually any trans woman that they had even a slightest animosity for, including the victim of the Kinkster rapist. They've done other fucked stuff, like chased 2 trans women of color off this site for trying to make a zine, but yeah, that's like just some of it. I'm not up for going over the messy details of the whole shit parade. Full disclosure, I made a lot of excuses for these sacks of crap, even while they were out there spreading false crap about me. I wasn't aware of the worst shit they were doing until much, much later. From @punlynch. The Downfall of Baeddelism. Sometime between the group's formation in 2013 and their downfall near the end of 2014, Otto Gynophil, also Eve, the de facto ringleader of the Baedel movement, began what baeddels referred to as a transbian safe house. This was apparently intended as a place for unhoused trans women lesbians and trans women who, in general, had sworn off contact with men, the ultimate goal of the lesbian separatist ideology at the core of the Baedel movement. It was thus also referred to as a commune by some and as a cult by others. One occupant of the safe house, L, later posted to Tumblr that they had been raped by Eve during their stay and detailed their experiences. The Baedels, rather than believing the victim and ousting the rapist from their movement, chose to close ranks around Eve instead. Another screenshot. I stand with Eve. Opium hug. Firmly, unequivocally, unapologetically. If you have a problem with this, get away from me, my blog, and my personal space. You are my enemy. Hashtag gotta reblog this on the big blog. Various reasons were given for this. The victim must be lying. The victim and anyone who believed them were simply transmisogynistic. Anyone who disagrees with the Baedels is an enemy of the movement, a carceral thinker, and a danger to trans women as a whole. Trans women are incapable of sexually abusing anyone. Standing with Eve was the ultimate sign of loyalty to the movement, and thus a mark of pride and honor. It was okay to keep being a Baedel no matter what, because rape accusations should be a personal matter. You can read more about Eve's own denial of these events here and here. Years later, even people involved in the initial group have spoken out against the movement and actions of those involved. Screenshot from Leslie Harpy. I was in the Baedels for years, and we straight up did horrible shit. We harassed anyone that disagreed for any reason. Our politics were terrible. Our isolationism made an environmental right for abuse that I have firsthand experience of. There is nothing in that group that needs salvaging or defending. Also, acting like people are just bringing this up out of the blue is silly. It's being brought up because people are still trying to defend the shit we did instead of fucking recognizing that it was wrong. Creating this myth that hate on the Baedels is just a way of keeping trans women in line is a tacit defense of the horrid shit we did. A second screenshot from Leslie Harpy. I'm sorry, but I served my time in shitty, awful Baedel group in early mid-2010s, and it fucking sucked ass. This weird post-leftist milieu of trans girls with the most awful politics you've ever seen in your entire life, who convince themselves that anyone who's hey, this shit is fucked up, is actually motivated solely and entirely by trans misogyny and not liking race play and incest shit because it's actually fucked up is insane. It's straight up cult, the way you build this self-reinforcing network wherein anyone on the outside looking in with any criticism is unsafe, not to be trusted, only there to hurt trans women, and the only people you can trust is this self-selected group of trans women. Separatism continues to fucking suck and make everything worse and make the people involved in it worse, even if you don't blatantly call what it is. Leslie Harpy was one of the original Baedels, and one of the first people to like the first Baedel post by an object. This was not the only instance of abuse by people associated with Baedelism. Elle posted their statement on August 4th, 2014. Between that time and September of the same year, another user by the name of Quinn posted about her own experiences with abuse at the hands of Monetize Your Cat. Kat's roommates in Seattle posted about their experiences with Kat shortly after Quinn did. Both parties alleged that Kat had been a manipulative and abusive roommate, friend, and partner. Kat first attempted to argue the accusations, then later admitted they were true and left the site. Her blog still contains her parting message. It has been pointed out that this is not necessarily an action taken in good faith and desire for growth. The reception of her abuse allegations followed a similar pattern to Eve's. People who ascribed to her ideology, baeddels included, believed that Kat was not and could not have been abusive as a trans woman. Others ignored warnings about her past and potential future actions, citing trans misogyny as the reason she must have been accused at all. It has also been pointed out that Kat's ideology, and relatedly, baeddel ideology, was extremely conducive to abuse, if not entirely constructed in order to allow abuse. Why it matters and why baeddelism never really fell. Baeddelism itself has seen multiple attempts at resurgence by various individuals, including documented experiences with self-proclaimed baeddels as recently as 2018, well after the movement first fell in 2014. Most proponents of Baeddelism 2.0, a revival of the original movement, argues that the abuse that occurred within the original movement was either completely fabricated by detractors, sound familiar, or at minimum not actually inherent to the ideology. And of course, there are some original baeddels still active on Tumblr today. Baeddelism never actually went away. Baeddelism was only one name for a set of beliefs that existed long before the specific term did, and hasn't gone anywhere since the original baeddel movement died down. What the baeddels did was put a name to the ideology Monetize Your Cat was cultivating before them, and what Kat did was popularize, centralize, and justify a way of thinking that had existed before she ever made her blog. This ideology has since been referred to loosely as TERFism, trans-inclusive radical feminism. It is rare that anyone actually refers to themselves as a TERF, and there is no real centralized TERF movement. Rather, a loose collection of radical feminist beliefs circulates various transgender spaces. The validity of these beliefs is generally taken for granted. Of course, trans women are the most oppressed people. Of course, trans women are inherently and unequivocally victims of all situations. Of course, trans men are inherently oppressors. Of course, trans men are dangerous and evil, and so on. Like radical feminism and subsequently trans-exclusive radical feminism, TERFism, those ideas are fundamentally dangerous. The defining tenets of radical feminism are that misogyny is the root of all oppression, and that rather than misogyny being an issue of power and control on a society-wide level, it is instead, or also, a matter of oppression and privilege on an individual level. Men are always oppressors, and women are always victims. These beliefs fundamentally exclude and erase the experiences of other marginalized people, namely, people of color and indigenous people, whose experience with and concepts of gender do not fall within the strict and rigid lines that white, Western, colonialist peoples do. Radical feminism is not a redeemable ideology. It cannot be reshaped into something good. It is fundamentally broken, and the movements born from it, lesbian separatism, political lesbianism, TERFism, and baeddelism, are proof enough of that. They each promote only surface-level variations of what is fundamentally cult-like thinking. Only the in-group can be victimized. Only the in-group is safe. The out-group is inherently and universally dangerous. Only the in-group understands you. All members of the in-group are, fundamentally, incapable of abuse. We cannot allow these ideas to be perpetuated within or without the trans community. Learn the signs and prevent the harm. A screenshot from Tumblr by Berlin Interrupted. I have to wonder what the entire point I guess is of reintroducing the sort of bogeyman of the baeddel. Response by Insurrectionary Compassion. You're only saying this because you're not an ex-member who has to see these people consistently sanitize their cover-up of numerous internal abuses. Here's what we can do to prevent this from happening again. Learn what baeddel ideology and TERFism looks like, even detached from the name. Learn what radical feminism looks like, even detached from the name, even from people who claim to oppose radical feminism. Act on dog whistles. Call them what they are. Do not allow people to downplay the harm all forms of radical feminism have caused. Remind each other that radical feminism is not a redeemable ideology, and seek out other branches of feminism instead. Remember the harm that has been caused. Remember that it will be caused again if these things are allowed to go unchecked. Listen to and uplift marginalized people. Allow them to speak to their own experiences, identify their own needs, and name their own oppression. Remember who the real oppressors are, and do not pit marginalized people against each other. The people perpetuating and benefiting from transphobia are cis people, and more specifically, cis people in power. Build solidarity with other marginalized people. One group of trans people cannot gain liberation without liberating all trans people, and one group of trans people cannot be targeted without the rest of us suffering as well. Remember that there is no group or identity incapable of enacting abuse, violence, harassment, and other harm against each other. Victimhood should not be determined based solely on an individual's identity. Remember that there are no acceptable targets for violence, cruelty, harassment, and abuse. Red flags to watch out for. Using or interacting with people who use baeddel anywhere in their usernames, blog descriptions, about blurbs, or other forms of self-identification. Downplaying the harm original baeddels did, calling them misled, their actions mistakes, but otherwise supporting or making apologies for their ideology. Obfuscating, ignoring, or erasing the abuse and rape allegations against members of the baeddel movement, especially if they claim those were made only with trans-misogynistic intent and or erase the trans-femme identity of the victims. Obfuscating, ignoring, or erasing the harm done to other trans femmes by baeddels. Claiming TERFs only target, harm, or have ill will for trans women / trans femmes, using TWERF or TWEEF instead of TERF. Claiming trans masculine people should not have any say in conversations about misogyny, transphobia, and or TERFs. Talking about AFAB privilege or otherwise implying that AFAB people share any universal quality or disposition aside from being assigned female at birth. Referring to trans people by assigned gender at birth, TME, TMA distinction, or even trans femme, trans masc frequently or exclusively, actively erasing or not allowing room for non-binary and intersex experiences that do not fall within those binaries. Implying men, cis or trans, would be better if they were made into women instead. Implying attraction to men or being a man is somehow a curse or a burden or otherwise unfortunate. Implying a fear of men, including trauma-induced phobias, should never be healed from or sought treatment for. Implying men, cis or trans, cannot also experience trauma around men. Treating trans men or trans masculine people as acceptable targets in any way for harassment, for abuse, for misgendering, for inducing dysphoria, etc. Implying trans masc dysphoria is toxic masculinity. Characterizing trans mascs as hysterical, whiny, delusional, crazy, or otherwise using feminine stereotypes. Implying it is femininity, specifically, that is targeted by the patriarchy, that feminine people are targeted more than masculine people, that trans femmes are the most targeted for their rejection of masculinity in favor of femininity, or the implication that masculinity is only ever looked down upon by feminists. Dismissing, erasing, punishing / ostracizing, disavowing, or treating with suspicion trans feminine people who do not agree with baeddel or radfem ideology, insisting all or most trans femmes agree with baeddel or radfem ideas, using listen to trans femmes to silence other groups of trans people, and otherwise implying trans femmes are a monolith who happen to agree with you. In general, espousing the ideas, fundamental or otherwise, that define the baeddel movement, including TERF and radical feminist ideology. This list is not comprehensive, nor is any one thing on this list 100% certain to indicate that someone is a baeddel, or if they are, that they are necessarily dangerous. It's important to keep in mind how many people are groomed into this movement and abused within it. Some of those who espouse baeddel rhetoric may themselves be victimized by others. But until we recognize these ideas for what they are and where they've come from, history can only repeat itself. Educate yourself and others. It would take a long, long time and a lot more space to detail all of the damage done, the people hurt, and the dangers of continuing to allow these ideas to be perpetuated. Instead, I've compiled some resources and references. I urge you to check these out, bookmark them for later, or whatever else works for you. They're also much, much shorter reads than this has been. And that is going to be it. I can later go back and read some of these screenshots and read some of the links to other people, and I'm hopefully going to be roping Briar in for some conversations and interviews that Greyson has done, but I really applaud him for all of this, and I'm glad that he was very excited about me creating the audio version for people like me who can't sit down and read, but like to listen to stuff and be doing their chores at the same time. So expect more about this, probably after I'm back from Disney, and I've given my dog a very big hug because I'm going to be separated from her for like 5 days, and I hope you all stay safe, take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you later. Bye. Colonialist. God damn it. I have to wonder what the entire point, I guess, is of render. It's all the likes.